The Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington presents World Focus, a continuing series on international political, social, economic, and cultural issues.
Hello, my name is Martin Jaffe. I'm this year acting chair of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Washington, and it's my pleasure to introduce the 1988-89 lectures sponsored by Samuel and Althea Stroum in Jewish Studies. This year's lecturer was Michael A. Meyer of Hebrew Union College, professor of modern Jewish history. His lectures were entitled Jewish Identity in the Modern World, Its Nature and Dynamics. Before I introduce Professor Meyer and say a few words about his lectures, I thought it would be appropriate to simply remind us all of the nature of the series, the lecture series in which he's offering his presentation today. The Samuel and Althea Stroum lectures have been continuing without break since 1975-1976, when the first lectures were offered. There have since been 14 lectures, including those of Professor Meyer this past month. A number of the lectures, as you may know, have already been published, some very, very influentially. Professor Yosef Yerushalmi, who spoke in 1982-83, published his lectures as Zachor, a book which has received wide distribution, has been translated into 5 languages. I suppose that has perhaps been the most successful. We're very happy to announce that Robert Alter's lectures of 1986-87 have been published as The Invention of Hebrew Prose by the University of Washington Press, Modern Fiction and the Language of Realism, and that book has been reviewed very, very positively already, just having come out. A second lecture is already in press. A new lecture is already in press, that of William Deaver, who spoke in 1985 on recent archaeological discoveries and biblical research, and that volume should be out very, very shortly, and I hope you'll be looking for it. We have now published, I believe, 6 of the lectures, and they are now an impressive addition to the University of Washington's publication record in Jewish studies, and we're very proud of them. It's just a few words about the lectures which you're about to view, those of Michael Meyer. Michael Meyer himself has become a very important and internationally recognized scholar in the history of modern Judaism and of the Jews in modern times. One of his more important works is a volume that came out in the late 60s at Wayne State University Press called The Origins of the Modern Jew, in which Professor Meyer described the various intellectual and social tensions surrounding emancipation in the late 18th century, which contributed to the kind of strategies of self-identification that Jews would choose, particularly in Germany and following the German model throughout the modern world from the 19th well into the 20th century. More recently, Professor Meyer has published a very important history of the movement of Reform Judaism called Response to Modernity, A History of the Reform Movement in Judaism. That was published by Oxford University Press just this past year and has received excellent notices. Professor Meyer's lectures for us this year have been entitled Jewish Identity in the Modern World, Its Nature and Dynamics. And here Professor Meyer proposes to sum up for us a good 15 years of his research on the study of modern Jewry and the various systems of Judaism or ideologies of Jewish identity, which the Jews in modern times have constructed for themselves by way of connecting their present, which is in many cases very, very discontinuous with the past, to some version of the past which they have chosen for themselves. The lectures, as you might have heard, have been very successful this year in particular. Professor Meyer spoke to standing room only crowds, and I think all those who attended found that it was a truly magnificent presentation. Professor Meyer speaks beautifully, thinks deeply, and inspired all of us with the whole project of modern Jewish identity. And I hope those of you who are viewing his lectures on video will enjoy them as much as we did, who were privileged to attend. And without any further introduction, let me invite you to enjoy the 1988-89 Stroum Lectures by Michael A. Meyer. Thank you very much.
In the rich spiritual treasury of the Jewish religion, there is no more powerful symbol than Zion. As Sinai signifies the coalescence of a loosely formed bond of Israelites into a people covenanted with God, Zion represents the fulfillment of that covenant. On Mount Zion in Jerusalem, the people established its worship. Thrice yearly they made pilgrimage to it. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and the Holy Land was lost, Zion became both a memory of earlier glory and the hope of yet greater glory to come. As a messianic symbol, it came to represent both the return of the people to its land and the redemption for Israel and for all humanity. In no small measure, it was the unfulfilled dream of Zion that kept Jews loyal to their faith. Jewish enlightenment did not attempt to destroy the immensely pervasive power of Zion. It only altered its contours. Reason stripped the concept of its miraculous elements. Universalism shifted its focus from the particular redemption of Israel to the reign of peace among all nations. But insofar as they remain Jewish at all, rationalists and universalists continue to focus their Jewish identity toward the unattained ideal. In the prophets of ancient Israel, Jewish modernists found a vision of a universal Zion whose symbolic center was Jerusalem. It was precisely the messianic task, Jews in the West argued, that made Jewish survival necessary, and escape from Judaism on account of discrimination and persecution, a betrayal of Israel's mission. Anti-Semitism represented both the world's rejection of that ideal and the Jews' need to suffer for its realization. Thus, even rationalized and universalized in the crucible of modernity, Jewish messianism continued, as in earlier times, to act as a centripetal force, uniting Jews in the common conviction that Zion had not yet been realized. To be a Jew, in addition to all of its other meanings, retained the fundamental sense of living in an unredeemed world. Nonetheless, Zion also served as a symbol of division. Traditional Jews waited for God to send the Messiah, who would lead Israel back to its land. They associated Zion with the reinstitution of animal sacrifices in a rebuilt temple. They believed they could hasten the redemption only through more scrupulous adherence to the divinely ordained moral and ritual law. But modern religious Jews, dwelling within the context of emancipation, either played down the return to Zion, assigning it to a distant time and depriving it of any immediate political consequence, as did modern Orthodoxy, or gave up hope of the return entirely and removed it from the liturgy, which is what the Reform Jews did. Jewish socialists substituted a messianic vision of their own, in which all of suffering humanity, and not Israel in particular, was deemed needful of worldly redemption. The modern Zionist movement rejected both the older relation to Zion and its recent reinterpretation. Zionism valued the traditional Jews' unwillingness to exchange the tangible Zion of the land of Israel for some universalized ideal, and it even sought to recapture something of the undiluted particularism of the as yet unmodernized Jews in Eastern Europe. But it could not accept the ingrained, divinely sanctioned passivity predicated on the belief that redemption was not to be wrought by human hands. For a Jew to become a Zionist was to take the people's destiny in his or her own hands. Zionism's relation to enlightenment was similar. As Zionism would not have been possible without the millennial hope of return nurtured by Judaism through the ages, so it required the heritage of enlightenment, precisely in order to transcend the passivity of the tradition. It was secular analysis that brought Zionists to reject the view that exile and anti-Semitism were God's punishment for Israel's ancient sins. It was faith in the operation of reason in the world that prompted political Zionists to lay out their ambitious plans. But enlightenment had led to an assimilation that Zionists in the West knew intimately from their own families. Jewish universalism was eroding the capacity for Jewish survival. And, as we saw last Thursday evening, enlightened Jews had manifested a poor capacity to resist the debilitating impact of anti-Semitism. They had allowed anti-Semitism to minimize their Jewishness out of fear of giving offense. The need, ever and again, to prove adherence to the political structures and national values of the states in which they lived had forced Westernized Jews to squeeze Jewish identity into the narrow confines of religious affiliation. To become a Zionist, therefore, was to transcend the pernicious effects of Enlightenment and anti-Semitism, even while utilizing their benefits. Henceforth, the Zionists said, reason would serve national purposes. Anti-Semitism would not only act as a brake on assimilation, its unhappy consequences would point to Zionism as the only adequate solution to the ubiquitous Jewish question. Zionism, then, set out to redirect old and new forces operating upon Jewish identity from within and from without, using their energy to forge a new movement. Now, where the supporters of that movement differed greatly among themselves was on the nature of this new Zionist identity. Closest to tradition were the religious Zionists, for whom Zionism was a natural outgrowth of Judaism. They favored settlement of the land and could view the Zionist enterprise as the beginning stages of the promised redemption. But they insisted that its final consummation remained in the hands of God. For them, Zionism was not a substitute for the older forms of Jewish identity. They saw themselves as still fundamentally Jews in the pre-Zionist sense, except that they were willing to join secularists in a common enterprise. In an ultimate sense, Zion continued to mean for these religious Zionists the rebuilding of the temple and the establishment of a society governed fully by Jewish law. Their Zionism, in other words, was conditional upon the movement's maintaining neutrality on questions of religion and culture. These religious adherents of Zionism allied themselves most closely with the political Zionists, whose most prominent spokesman, of course, was Theodor Herzl, the founder of the International Zionist Movement. There was a lack of ultimacy in Herzl's vision that made it easier for these traditional religious Jews drawn to Zionism to cooperate with him. Political Zionists were generally willing to hold questions of Jewish content in abeyance. Their principal concern was to rescue Jews from the physical and spiritual effects of anti-Semitism. The Jewish society in the land of Israel that Herzl envisaged would approximate the more enlightened societies of Europe. Within that society, the Jewish religion would have a role not greatly different from what it was in the diaspora. Herzl neither attempted to secularize Judaism nor to absorb religion within national culture. Although political Zionism, with its insistence that anti-Semitism was a permanent feature of Jewish life in the diaspora, challenged Western Jews' sense of security, it was not directed against any particular forms of Jewish expression. It did not berate the religious positions of either modern Orthodoxy or of Reform Judaism in the West. It did not criticize the traditional values that were still cherished in the East. Minimally, one could become a political Zionist simply out of the conviction that Jews in distress required a safe refuge somewhere in the world. As the Zionism of Louis Brandeis in the United States attests, such philanthropic sentiments and the activities flowing from them did not necessarily require a reorientation of personal loyalties or values. For other Jews in the West, especially those without firm religious faith, political Zionism did provide a new national identity, but only very rarely did it motivate any radical change in the pattern of their lives. For existing forms of Jewish identity, it was not political, but cultural Zionism that offered the most serious challenge. Ahad Ha'am, the pen name of Asher Ginsburg, its progenitor and chief spokesman, was an agnostic in belief, a non-halachic Jew in practice. For him, unlike for Herzl, Zionism was not principally a matter of externals. It was less a question of altering the conditions under which Jews lived than of transforming the Jews themselves. Herzl's goal was to give Jews like himself, Europeans of the Jewish religious denomination, their own state, where they could live at peace, freed from the scourge of anti-Semitism. Ahad Ha'am wanted to transform the Jew's inner self. Religion would cease to be its indispensable essence. Ahad Ha'am, the East European Jewish intellectual, sought to create a Zionism that would draw Jewish secularists back into the Jewish orbit, not merely as proponents of a political project like Herzl, but as bearers of a pervasive Jewish identity. His task was to show that being a secular Jew was not wholly discontinuous with a Jewish past dominated by religion. He therefore cast his eye on those elements in Jewish history with which even philosophical positivists like himself could still identify. Prophetic morality, the Pharisaic balance of body and intellect. These, he argued, were values still worthy of identification, even for secular Jews. Moreover, they would set the Jews apart in the future as they had in the past. Now, Ahad Ha'am's thinking reflects a very important shift in the nature of Jewish identity. Jewishness, to his mind, was not adherence to a set of beliefs and practices. Rather, it meant possessing a share in that ruach, that spirit, which had created those values. The Jewish spirit that animated the people in every age had produced the Jewish religion, but it was also responsible for the Jews' broader intellectual and cultural attainments. Religion was historically its most important component, but religion was not the essence of Jewishness. Not surprisingly, Ahad Ha'am's spiritual or cultural Zionism became the bête noire of religious Jews of all kinds, East and West. Whether Orthodox or Reformers, whether for religious reasons or political ones, they were determined to reject a Jewish identity that embraced secularity as Jewishly not less legitimate than religious faith. For Ahad Ha'am, Zion represented the goal of this Jewish spirit. To return to Zion was both to return to the physical land of Israel and to create there a new efflorescence of Jewish culture. As the Jewish people could not survive except in continuity with Jewish history, so it could not sustain intense intellectual and cultural productivity apart from the land that had nourished it in ancient times. Ahad Ha'am deplored the narrow confines into which recent rabbinic Judaism had driven the Jewish spirit. Conversely, he was confident that given an inner revival, that spirit could once more expand to a breadth that it had attained in earlier periods of Jewish history. He intended that wide-ranging intellectual creativity would characterize Jewish culture in the future. But other Jewish nationalists thought he wasn't going far enough. They found that Ahad Ha'am, despite his secularism, was on account of his intellectualism and strong moralism still too much a Jew of the old type. He was not willing to accommodate within Jewish culture any values, such as those espoused by Nietzsche, that were very popular at that time, which Ahad Ha'am regarded as wholly alien to the moral orientation of Judaism. More revolutionary ideologists wanted not merely to make room for secularism within a national Jewish identity, they insisted upon the freedom to import doctrines that stood in stark opposition to Jewish tradition, even when that tradition was more broadly interpreted. Jewish intellectualism, with its sworn opposition, for example, to the delights of the senses, this was, to their mind, as unacceptable and as narrow a form of Jewish identity as was Orthodox religion. Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, the prominent Hebrew writer, stood in revolt against such what he regarded as narrow, excessive Jewish intellectualism. This narrow concentration on spirit, he believed, had led to neglect of the sensual, earthly life. Berdichevsky therefore drew into consciousness those periods and events of the Jewish past that lent support to a very different self-conception. Especially attractive to him and to those who followed in his footsteps, were the Maccabees, the ancient warriors for national independence. In Zionist circles, the celebration of Hanukkah soon came to focus on Jewish heroism rather than on that miraculous cruse of oil that burned for 8 days. Zionists also rehabilitated Shimon bar Kokhba, the failed military messiah of the 2nd century. To dramatize their new identity, they often spoke of themselves now as Hebrews rather than as Jews. Thus, the Zionist movement not only differentiated itself from the bulk of diaspora Jewry that long opposed it, on numerous issues it was internally divided as well. Its identity ideal lay in the future. The national Jew, in fact, did not yet fully exist. Some Zionists even admitted that the Jews collectively had still to regain their peoplehood. We are not yet a people. We are only individual Jews, lamented Ahad Ha'am in 1892. However much the Zionist movement stressed the national ties binding Jews to each other, it could not set before world Jewry a consistent image of the new Zionist Jew. Would he or she be secular or religious? A believer in Jewish normalcy or a believer in chosenness? Culturally a European living in a Jewish state, or contrariwise a Jew by culture drawing upon the Jewish spirit to create a focal point for Jewish particularity in the ancient land? Thus, rather ironically, the movement that set out to unify the Jewish people sowed its share of discord instead. Yet as the ideal of political Zionism neared realization, in the wake of Nazism and the Holocaust, most external Jewish opposition melted away. Once it became clear that anti-Semitism was not a vestige of the past, sympathy with efforts to establish a refuge for persecuted Jews became an integral part of Jewishness. As for the nature of Zionism, seen from a different perspective, the variety of positions appeared a point of strength. Jews of varying political, religious, and cultural orientations could find a wing of Zionism that corresponded to their views. Thus, by 1948, Zionism had fully mobilized the centripetal force of Jewish peoplehood. With the establishment of the state, its focal significance for Jewish identity was no longer in question. Yet the state of Israel itself soon created new and unprecedented questions of Jewish identity. The term Israeli was equivocal from the beginning. In its most precise and legal sense, it meant any citizen of the state, a person who possesses an Israeli identity card, by one definition. Hence, it included non-Jews. Yet Israeli is not merely a designation of political status. Beyond citizenship, it is also a category of ethnic identity. To be an Israeli, it is generally believed, means to be a Jew residing permanently in the land of his or her ancestors. Even those non-Jewish citizens of Israel who most fully identify themselves as Israelis cannot quite do so in that sense. An Israeli Arab must feel a certain ambivalence about his political identity as an Israeli. My country, Israel, is at war with my people, the Arabs, one of them has said. The term Israeli has been no less problematic for Israeli Jews. It is the term of identity that separates existence in the homeland from existence in the diaspora. Jew and Zionist are identity designations that unite the Jewish people. Israeli divides. Not surprisingly, it is this name that is stressed in discussions that differentiate the two Jewries. Jews who make Aliyah from the United States continue to be Jews and Zionists, but they now also take on the identity, the new identity, of Israeli. The inner content of that identity consists of an amalgam of values, many of them rooted in early Zionism. In contrast to the diaspora Jew, the Israeli believes himself to be self-reliant, proud, unafraid. Unacquainted with anti-Semitism, the born Israeli, the Sabra, lacks hypersensitivity to the opinions of strangers. As an Israeli, his identity is rooted in a short but colorful history of his own, a history of some 40 years. The Zionist identity of Israelis, going on now to the Zionist identity of Israelis, is much less obvious. The vast majority of Jewish Israelis do consider themselves Zionists, but they're not quite certain what that means after 1948. Some simply associate it with Israeli patriotism. For them, as Jews living in a Jewish state, Zionism is merely commitment to continue the land settlement and nation building begun by the first pioneers. For others, it represents their link with the widely scattered Jewish people outside of Israel. One survey taken during the Yom Kippur War showed that 96% of Israelis feel that they are part of the Jewish people. Their Zionism therefore requires them to be concerned for physically and spiritually oppressed Jewries all over the world, and above all, to encourage their immigration to Israel. Liberals in Israel feel it also implies, conversely, that all Jews have a share in the state of Israel and not the Israelis alone. Zionism further provides for the Israelis a prehistory for the Israeli experience. The Israeli identity, in other words, is historically rooted in its Zionist predecessor, and by extension, Zionist history reaches back to earlier times preceding or paralleling Jewish history. It is the history of those periods when Jews lived in their land and of the longing for Zion when they were forced to live in the diaspora. It is the history of Jewish villages that existed in the land even during medieval times, and of course it is the history of the modern settlement. But it is emphatically not the history of Jewish suffering. It is not the history of the Holocaust. The latter belong to Jewish history, not to the Zionist-Israeli continuum. Recently, Zionism has taken on a highly controversial meaning. Just as from the beginning of the Zionist movement, the most complete commitment to Zion was personal participation in the redemption of the land, Geulat Haaretz, by Jewish settlement, so the deepest expression of Zionism today is considered by some to be the extension of that redemption to Judea and Samaria. The settlers on the West Bank, it is believed, are today's Zionists in the fullest sense, more so even than those who continue to settle on hitherto untilled land within the pre-1967 boundaries. It is this concept of contemporary Zionism that is propounded especially in the Israeli religious school system. So we have Israeli and we have Zionist from the Israeli perspective. Now we come to the identity Jew in Israel, an identity which is yet more equivocal than either Israeli or Zionist. Israel's law of return defines a Jew for purposes of state as someone born of a Jewish mother or converted to Judaism and who belongs to no other religion. But this compromise definition is wholly acceptable to very few. Orthodox Jews complain of its failure to specify that conversion must be in accordance with Jewish law. Liberals find birth to a Jewish mother an insufficiently broad criterion. And some secular Israelis reject any religious definition of Jewishness on principle. At best, the law provides a modus operandi, certainly not a basis of Jewish identity. The determination of what Jewishness means for the Israeli requires distinguishing sharply between religious and secular Jews in Israel. As repeated studies have shown, it is the religious Israelis who feel the most Jewish, since Jewishness to them represents more than just an ethnic identity. Their fundamental worldview is determined by the Jewish religion. Not surprisingly, they feel close to Jews in the diaspora since they share the same religious commitment. Jewishness for secular Israelis, by contrast, evokes ambivalence. Zionism, after all, was a revolt against the Jewishness that the early Zionists criticized so severely, both in Eastern and Western Europe. It was supposed to transcend Jewish passivity on the one hand and the truncated modern religious identity produced by Enlightenment on the other. For some secular Israelis, Zionist and then Israeli identity are still seen as post-Jewish. One survey taken in the mid-60s found that the majority of Israeli students in secular schools felt that being Jewish was of little or no importance in their lives. Close to 1/3, if they were to live abroad, would not wish to have been born as Jews. As one student put it, Jewish religion has no meaning for me. In Israel, where all are Jews, I don't mind also being a Jew. But outside of Israel, why be a Jew? The nature of Jewish existence outside the state, admitted a former Israeli Minister of Education, is beyond the perspective of the native-born Israeli. Israeli Jews have great difficulty identifying with their counterparts in the diaspora. They have seen them as essentially different from themselves. Remarkably, almost 1/3 of Israeli parents and students in one survey actually believe that the main cause of anti-Semitism lies in the characteristics of diaspora Jews themselves. About 50% of students surveyed saw diaspora Jews as, quote, different people, end quote. The differences have been especially marked for Afro-Asian Jews, who are ethnically the most distant from the largest diaspora community in the United States. With regard to their own self-definition, Israeli secularists also have problems with a Jewish identity that is represented by those who seek to expand the influence of religion in Israeli public life. They find themselves at one and the same time Jews in an ethnic sense and opponents of Jews in a more complete sense, as it were, whose efforts to Judaize the state on the basis of Jewish law they firmly reject. They can appreciate the value of the Jewish religion in shoring up the sense of peoplehood in the diaspora, but that task is not required in the state of Israel. And yet at the same time, but apparently in a non-halachic sense, nearly all Israelis feel that Israel must somehow be a Jewish state. And in recent years, feelings of Jewish identification have been more closely linked to religion, even among Jews on the secular side of the Israeli spectrum. It has been widely observed that the Jewish identity of Israelis increases in salience at times when they feel most isolated from other nations. This was evident both in 1967 and in 1973, when it seemed that only the Jewish diaspora was Israel's wholehearted ally. It may also be that the feeling of vulnerability experienced before the outbreak of the Six-Day War and the first days of the Yom Kippur conflict served to diminish the sense of Israeli difference from Jewries elsewhere. Jewish existence in Israel now seemed no less beleaguered than it had been through the centuries of the diaspora. Israelis began to speak of the danger of a second Holocaust. The Six-Day War was significant for Jewish identity in Israel also in a second sense. Even secular Israelis experienced a quasi-religious sense of salvation when fear turned to triumph and holy places, long in Arab hands, became once more accessible to Israeli Jews. The religious-secular dichotomy was temporarily bridged. Since 1967, there has been a pronounced tendency on the part of both Orthodox and secular Jews in Israel to associate Jewishness with the struggle against the Arabs. As one leader of Messianist orthodoxy put it, quote, "Since I believe in Segulah, in Jewish chosenness, I consider a man undergoing a test of fire on the Golan Heights or in the Sinai a Jew in the fullest sense of the word, even if he has never been exposed to a formal Torah education," end quote. While most Israeli Jews still set the term Jew in opposition to the term Gentile, an increasing number set it against Arab instead, not Jew-Gentile, but Jew-Arab. Some non-religious Sephardi Jews wear a skull cap, the mark of an Orthodox Jew, lest their Mediterranean appearance leads someone to assume that they are Arabs. Increasingly also, Jewishness in Israel has come to mean not only the belief that Israel should be a Jewish state, but insistence upon the sanctity of the land and the consequent unwillingness to compromise possession of any of its parts for the sake of a political goal. The expansion of Israel is deemed to be God's will. To the Israeli mind in general, Judaism is associated with an intense particularism that values the Jews above others. Thus, although not all the Orthodox, to be sure, support retention of Judea and Samaria at any price, Jewishness becomes for Israeli liberals to some degree a negative identity on account of its association with messianic politics. Jewishness and liberalism appear to be in conflict. A political liberal in Israel who stresses his Jewishness is a relatively rare phenomenon. There is still one other sense in which Jewishness is problematic for some Israelis. One can be a Jew either in Israel or in the diaspora. but one can be an Israeli only in Israel. With recent statistics showing that more Jews leave Israel permanently than migrate there from the diaspora, concerned Israelis have increasingly stressed the higher virtue of Israeliness and emphasized the negative character of Jewishness in the diaspora. Only exclusive education to the Israeli identity can prevent emigration. No one has put this more strongly than the prominent Israeli writer Aleph Bet Yehoshua. In a newspaper interview, he said, quote, "The continuous use of these two concepts, Israeliness and Jewishness, simultaneously, already creates in every child the first notion of emigration from Israel. If you are also a Jew apart from your Israeliness, then anytime, when you feel like it or when you're in trouble, you can join the Jewish life of the diaspora. Every 6-year-old child has already received from his kindergarten teacher the formula for his yeridah, his emigration. She can shout all she wants to about love of the land of Israel, but at the same time, she's also telling him, look what a marvelous people you belong to, a people that survived in the diaspora for 2,000 years and preserved its full identity. If so, the child says to himself, then I'll go to Los Angeles too and survive there, and I'll even receive a medal from Jewish history. The old Zionist doctrine of Shlilat HaGolah, negation of the diaspora, has regained prominence in the wake of demographic forecasts that predict a diminution in the percentage of Jews to Arabs, especially if the occupied territories are not returned to Arab sovereignty. Yet praise of Israeliness and derogation of diaspora Jewishness have not stemmed the tide of emigration. Lack of precise statistical data makes it difficult to determine the exact number of Israelis who have chosen to live permanently in America. Figures range from a low of 100,000 to over 500,000. Similarly to previous Jewish immigrations to the United States, once the process has begun, it tends to increase in momentum as more prospective immigrants have family members and neighbors already absorbed in the new society and able to assist them in acclimatizing to the new surroundings. Younger people, having established themselves economically, bring over their parents to join them. Israeli Yordim, as they are called, suffer an identity conflict without precedent in modern Jewish history. Indoctrinated in the high value of life in the Jewish homeland, identifying primarily as Israelis, they don't quite know what they are once they no longer live in Israel. Some actually persuade themselves that America represents the values that their land of origin has abandoned, and that someday they will bring back to Israel for the sake of its spiritual revival. But more commonly, they simply regard their sojourn in the United States as temporary. Even after years abroad, they continue to believe that they will return to Israel. They're only studying in America, or engaging in an interesting adventure, or building capital to live more comfortably in Israel. The Yordim are left with no appropriate or acceptable identity. Most find themselves psychologically incapable of adopting the label diaspora Jew. Instead, they cling tenaciously to the earlier self-designation of Israeli. And yet, as time passes, they really aren't Israelis anymore either. Or, to put it differently, their self-credibility as Israelis melts away further with each succeeding year abroad. To see themselves as diaspora Jews is particularly difficult for the secularists among them, since that represents adoption of an identity they have been taught to reject as religious, and at least partially, as opposed to being an Israeli. To see themselves as Zionists would be truly absurd. Zionists in contemporary America are Jews who give money to Israel, but in most instances have little direct personal connection with it. Despite well-intentioned efforts by local Jewish communities, emigrant Israelis have resisted attempts to absorb them within American Jewry. This has been especially true for the secularists who see the synagogue, so central an institution of Jewish identity in the diaspora, on the Israeli model as strictly a place of worship, which a secular Israeli visits not at all, or only casually on the high holidays. The liberal synagogue is wholly strange to nearly all of them. Israel-oriented community institutions are even more problematic than the synagogue. Raising money for Israel is so clearly a mark of diaspora Judaism that for your aid to do so would mean symbolically moving to the other side of the table. Hence, Israelis in America speak of having done their share by serving in the Israeli army, or insist that when they return, they will invest their hard-earned funds directly in the Israeli economy. Even the thought of sending their children to a Jewish school raises ambivalence. Fewer Israelis than American Jews do so. For a small number, the tensions inherent in this situation have produced a mild form of self-hate, most frequently manifest in the attribution of negative motives to other Yordim, from whom the individual sharply differentiates himself. What remains for emigrants from Israel are memories of the past and anxiety about the future. They come together in America to sing the old songs with which they grew up, or to see an Israeli film that reconnects them with the land. But their children rapidly become Americans. In an irony of Jewish history, some of them, these children, become ashamed of their foreign-sounding Israeli names. One father expressed the dilemma poignantly when he said, "Assuming that I stay on here, what will happen to my son? I won't go to synagogue. At most, I'll tell him stories about my home in the country I left, and take him to sing the songs we sang in our youth movements. I am an Israeli. I cannot become a Jew." End quote. If the Yordim in the United States are an embarrassment to themselves, they are so no less to American Jewry. For the notion that Jews should want to leave Israel flies in the face of American Jews' identification with Israel as an ideal of their own identity. It has been frequently pointed out that nothing so unifies diaspora Jews as their common commitment to Israel. It is for them not merely a place where fellow Jews dwell who are in need of their assistance. It is for many, at least potentially, what Achad Ha'am intended it to be, the center of Jewish life, and beyond that, the center of gravity for their own Jewishness. In one survey, 83% of American Jews responded that if Israel were destroyed, they would feel as if they had suffered one of the greatest personal tragedies of their lives. Never in modern times have Jews in the West been more committed to Jewish peoplehood. And most of them see Israel as its chief embodiment. If the United States continues to affirm cultural pluralism, as it has, in recent years, then it would seem likely that for American Jewry, the ethnic form of Jewish identity, embracing religion to varying degrees, will become even more characteristic. However, two factors militate against that result. The first is the gap in culture, values, and religion that separates some Israeli and diaspora Jews. For most American and European Jews, it is especially difficult to find common grounds with Israelis of Afro-Asian background who represent an increasing majority of Israel's Jewish population. Already 30 years ago, a young American Jew studying in Israel put it succinctly when he said, "Toward Israel, I feel we. Toward Israelis, they." More recently, some, but by no means all, diaspora Jews have become disenchanted with Israel's policies in the areas of politics and religion. Recent surveys suggest that except for the Orthodox, American Jewry's attachment to Israel is declining. Especially is this true among Reform Jews and more generally in the younger generation. If differences regarding values continue to widen between segments of Israeli and diaspora Jewries, they may seriously damage the sense of common identity. The second factor militating against ethnic unity is the phenomenon of Jews by choice. Especially in Reform and conservative congregations in the United States, the number of converts to Judaism has reached proportions where their influence is no longer negligible. As has often been pointed out, Jews by choice tend to understand Jewishness in terms parallel with Christianity. They see themselves as leaving one faith community for the sake of another faith community. Judaism for them is a religion, pure and simple. They have difficulty in internalizing the profound emotional tie that binds Jews to one another. Few see themselves as taking on Jewish peoplehood in addition to the Jewish faith. Ironically, Jews by choice sometimes marry born Jews whose Jewishness is peripheral. What their marriage partners usually do possess, though, is some vestige of ethnic attachment. The Jew by choice has as much difficulty understanding that residue as the born Jew does comprehending many a convert's extraordinary and admirable seriousness about the Jewish religion. Thus, Jewish peoplehood today seems a more fragile basis of modern Jewish identity than it was 2 decades ago when Jews everywhere basked in the seemingly miraculous salvation wrought by the Six-Day War. Tensions and differences between Israel and the diaspora and the changing nature of diaspora Jewry are working to loosen the bonds of solidarity. Still, the sense of peoplehood remains stronger than any other foundation of common Jewishness. Despite differences, Zion has retained its influence as the most powerful symbol of Jewish unity and common destiny.